It was almost 10 at night when Staff Sergeant David Thompson finished his shift at the Veterans Affairs Hospital. The decorated Marine sniper had been working late again, staying behind to help a fellow veteran who was struggling with nightmares from his time overseas. David never minded the extra hours. After 3 tours in Afghanistan, he understood what it meant to have someone in your corner when the darkness felt too heavy. The parking lot was quieter than usual as David walked toward his old pickup truck. The streetlights cast long shadows between the cars, and a cool breeze carried the scent of rain. He was thinking about getting home to his family when something caught his eye near the electronics store across the street. 2 figures were crouched by the back door of the shop, and one was holding what looked like a crowbar. David's military training kicked in immediately. He stopped walking and watched carefully, using the same focus that had kept him alive during countless dangerous missions. These weren't employees working late. The way they moved, constantly looking around, checking over their shoulders, this was definitely suspicious. David pulled out his phone and dialed 911. He kept his voice calm and clear as he spoke to the dispatcher. "I'm calling to report a possible break-in at Miller Electronics on Oak Street. I can see 2 people trying to force entry through the back door." He gave his exact location and stayed on the line, continuing to watch the suspects from a safe distance. The dispatcher told him officers were on their way and asked him to stay where he was. David had done everything right. He was a good citizen reporting a crime, helping to protect local businesses in his community. But as he waited for the police to arrive, he had no idea that his life was about to change forever. Within minutes, David heard the wail of sirens getting closer. But instead of the patrol cars heading toward the electronics store where the actual crime was taking place, they came straight toward him. 3 police cars pulled into the hospital parking lot with their lights flashing, surrounding David where he stood next to his truck. The first officer jumped out with his hand on his weapon. "Put your hands where I can see them," he shouted. David was confused but complied immediately. He raised his hands, still holding his phone. "Officer, I'm the one who called 911, David said calmly. "I reported the break-in across the street." But the second officer was already approaching with handcuffs ready. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," he ordered. David's heart started racing, but his military training helped him stay composed. "There's been a mistake. I called to report a crime. The suspects are over there at the electronics store. I'm David Thompson. I work here at the VA hospital." The third officer had joined them now, and none of them seemed interested in listening to David's explanation. "We received a call about a suspicious black male in the area of an attempted burglary," the first officer said. "That matches your description." David felt a chill run down his spine. He realized what was happening. Someone else had called the police too, but instead of reporting the actual criminals, they had reported him, simply for being black and present in the area. The officers had made their decision about who the criminal was before they even arrived. "Check my ID," David said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm a Marine veteran. I work at this hospital. I was the one who called you to report the crime." But the officers weren't interested in his identification. They were operating on assumptions and tunnel vision. In their minds, they had found their suspect, and nothing David said was going to change that. The first officer grabbed David's arm and spun him around roughly. "You have the right to remain silent." The officer began reading the Miranda rights as he forced David's hands behind his back. The metal handcuffs clicked into place, and David felt something break inside his chest. After serving his country with honor, after dedicating his post-military career to helping other veterans, he was being arrested for trying to prevent a crime. As they loaded him into the back of the patrol car, David looked across the street. The real criminals were gone now, probably scared off by all the police sirens and lights. They had escaped while the officers were busy arresting the wrong person. The irony was bitter and painful. David sat in the back seat, hands cuffed behind him, watching the familiar streets of his neighborhood pass by through the window. This was the same route he drove home every day after work, the same streets where he walked with his family on weekend mornings. But now he was seeing them from behind the steel mesh partition of a police car, accused of a crime he had tried to prevent. At the police station, The booking process was humiliating and dehumanizing. They took his fingerprints, his photograph, and his personal belongings. The desk sergeant barely looked at his military ID when David tried again to explain who he was. The system had already decided he was guilty, and individual officers weren't interested in questioning that decision. David was placed in a holding cell with several other men. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the smell of disinfectant mixed with unwashed bodies filled the air. He sat on the hard bench and put his head in his hands, trying to process what had happened to him. One of the other inmates, an older man with kind eyes, noticed David's distress. "First time?" he asked quietly. David nodded. "I called the police to report a crime. They arrested me instead." The older man shook his head sadly. "Same old story, son. Same old story." As the hours passed, David thought about his family waiting at home. His wife would be worried when he didn't come home from work. His children would ask questions he didn't know how to answer. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that sometimes the police arrest good people? How do you tell an 8-year-old that her father, who she thought was a hero, is sitting in jail? The worst part was the doubt that started creeping into David's mind. He began questioning himself, wondering if he had done something wrong. Maybe he should have stayed in his car. Maybe he shouldn't have been watching the suspects so closely. Maybe if he had been white, this wouldn't have happened. The thoughts were toxic, but they were hard to push away. Around midnight, a guard finally came to tell David that he could make his phone call. With shaking hands, he dialed his home number. When his wife answered, her voice thick with worry, David had to fight back tears. "I'm okay," he said softly. "But I need you to call a lawyer. There's been a terrible mistake." As he hung up the phone and was led back to his cell, David realized that his nightmare was just beginning. He was no longer just David Thompson, decorated Marine veteran and VA counselor. He was now David Thompson, criminal defendant, facing charges that could destroy everything he had worked for. The system that he had sworn to protect and serve had failed him completely. But David was a fighter. He had survived combat zones and helped other veterans through their darkest moments. He wasn't going to give up now, even though the battle ahead looked impossible to win. The next morning, David woke up on a thin mattress in the county jail, his body aching from the uncomfortable sleeping conditions. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then reality came crashing back like a cold wave. He was in jail, accused of a crime he didn't commit, and his life was falling apart. His wife, Linda, had managed to scrape together enough money for bail by borrowing from her sister and taking a cash advance on their credit card. When David walked out of the jail that afternoon, he felt like a different person. The confidence he had built during his military service and years of helping other veterans seemed to have vanished overnight. Linda was waiting for him in their old sedan, her eyes red from crying. She had barely slept, spending the night calling lawyers and trying to figure out how to help her husband. When David got in the car, they sat in silence for a long moment before she reached over and squeezed his hand. "We'll get through this," she whispered, but David could hear the uncertainty in her voice. The drive home was awkward and tense. David kept expecting to see police cars following them, even though he knew that was paranoid thinking. Everything felt different now. The streets he had walked safely for years suddenly seemed threatening. He wondered if neighbors were watching him, if they had seen the news reports about his arrest. At home, their 2 children were staying with Linda's mother. The house felt empty and cold without their laughter and energy. David sat at the kitchen table where he had eaten breakfast just 24 hours earlier, but it felt like a lifetime ago. Linda made coffee with shaking hands, and they tried to figure out what to do next. The first phone call came from David's supervisor at the VA hospital. Hospital policy required that employees be suspended immediately after any arrest, pending investigation. David had expected this, but it still felt like another punch to the stomach. He had devoted his post-military career to helping veterans deal with trauma and readjust to civilian life. Now he was banned from the job he loved. "How long will the suspension last?" Linda asked after David hung up. "Until the charges are resolved," David said quietly, "which could be months. Linda's face went pale. They lived paycheck to paycheck, and losing David's income meant they would struggle to pay rent and put food on the table. The legal fees would only make things worse. The local prosecutor's office was led by District Attorney Robert Mitchell, a man with political ambitions who saw high-profile cases as stepping stones to higher office. Mitchell was up for re-election in 6 months, and his campaign strategy was built around being tough on crime and protecting the community from dangerous criminals. When Mitchell reviewed David's case, he saw an opportunity. A decorated military, sniper accused of attempted burglary, was the kind of story that would grab headlines and show voters that he wasn't afraid to prosecute anyone, regardless of their background. Mitchell decided to pursue the charges aggressively, despite the weak evidence. The prosecutor assigned to the case was Jennifer Walsh, a young attorney trying to make her mark in the office. She had been told that this was a career-making case, and she threw herself into building what she believed was a strong prosecution. Walsh painted David as a dangerous individual whose military training made him a threat to the community. In the formal charges filed with the court, Walsh included language that was clearly designed to prejudice potential jurors. She described David as a trained sniper with extensive knowledge of surveillance and tactical operations, making it sound like his military service was somehow criminal. She suggested that his presence near the electronics store was part of a carefully planned burglary attempt. The local newspaper picked up the story 3 days after David's arrest. The headline read, "Military Sniper Arrested in Burglary Attempt." The article focused heavily on David's weapons training and his deployments overseas, while barely mentioning that he had called police to report the crime himself. David's heart sank as he read the story online. The reporter had clearly gotten most of the information from the prosecutor's office, and the article made him sound like a dangerous criminal. There was no mention of his work at the VA hospital or his efforts to help other veterans. The story painted him as someone who had used his military skills for criminal purposes. Social media made everything worse. The newspaper article was shared hundreds of times, and the comments section filled with people who had already decided David was guilty. Some comments were openly racist, while others questioned why a trained killer was allowed to work at a hospital. David's wife begged him to stop reading the comments, but he couldn't help himself. The worst part was how the story affected their children. Their 10-year-old son came home from school in tears, asking why his classmates were saying his daddy was a bad man. Their 8-year-old daughter became quiet and withdrawn, afraid to leave the house. Linda had to take time off work to deal with the children's emotional needs, which meant even less income for the family. David's court-appointed attorney was a tired-looking man named Thomas Brady, who seemed overwhelmed by his massive caseload. During their first meeting, Brady spent more time looking at his phone than listening to David's story. When David tried to explain what had really happened that night, Brady waved him off. "Look, David, I've been doing this for 20 years, Brady said. The prosecutor has a witness who saw you near the scene. They have your presence at the location. The best thing we can do is negotiate a plea deal. Maybe we can get you probation instead of jail time." David stared at his lawyer in disbelief. "I didn't do anything wrong. I called the police myself. I was trying to help." Brady shrugged. "That's your story, but juries don't always believe defendants. A plea deal is your safest option." David left the meeting feeling more hopeless than ever. His own lawyer didn't believe him and wasn't interested in fighting the charges. Brady seemed more concerned with clearing cases from his schedule than actually defending his clients. As the weeks passed, David's mental health began to deteriorate. He had trouble sleeping, and when he did sleep, he had nightmares about being in prison. He started avoiding friends and family members, ashamed of what people might think about him. The confident, capable man who had served his country with honor was being replaced by someone who felt scared and powerless. Linda watched her husband withdraw into himself and didn't know how to help him. She had never seen David so broken, not even when he came back from his combat deployments. The legal system was destroying him in ways that war never had. The couple's savings were quickly disappearing. Legal fees, lost income, and the stress of the situation were taking a toll on everything they had built together. Linda started working extra shifts at the clinic where she worked as a nurse, but it wasn't enough to cover all their expenses. David, began to understand why so many innocent people accepted plea deals. Fighting the charges seemed impossible when the system was stacked against him. His lawyer was pushing for a plea, the prosecutor was determined to get a conviction, and the media had already decided he was guilty. But deep inside, David still had the heart of a Marine. He had never given up during his toughest moments overseas, and he wasn't ready to give up now. Even though everything seemed hopeless, he knew he had to keep fighting. The truth had to matter for something. 3 weeks after David's arrest, retired Colonel James Rodriguez was having his morning coffee when his phone buzzed with a text message from an old Marine buddy. The message contained a link to the newspaper article about David's case. As Colonel, Rodriguez read the story. His coffee grew cold. Rodriguez had served with David during his second deployment in Afghanistan. He remembered David as one of the most reliable and honorable Marines he had ever commanded. The idea that David would commit a burglary was not just unlikely. It was impossible. Rodriguez knew there had to be more to this story. The Colonel immediately called his old friend Sergeant Major Pete Williams, who had also served with David. "Pete, have you seen this story about Thompson? This is complete nonsense." Pete had already heard about the case through the Veteran Network. "I've been following it, sir. Something stinks about this whole thing. David Thompson is one of the most honest men I've ever known. There's no way he did what they're saying." Within hours, Rodriguez and Williams had reached out to other Marines who had served with David. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Everyone who knew David was outraged by what was happening to him. These were men and women who had seen David risk his own life to save others, who had watched him show incredible courage under fire. Staff Sergeant Carlos Martinez had been in David's unit during a particularly dangerous mission where their convoy was ambushed. David had provided sniper cover while Martinez and 2 other wounded Marines were evacuated. "That man saved my life," Martinez told Colonel Rodriguez. "Now it's time for us to save his." The word spread through veteran organizations, military, Facebook groups, and VFW halls across the region. Marines who had never met David personally began sharing his story because they understood that an attack on one veteran was an attack on all of them. The brotherhood that had sustained them through combat was now mobilizing to protect one of their own. Colonel Rodriguez decided to take action. He contacted a retired military lawyer named Captain Lisa Chen, who now worked as a civilian defense attorney specializing in cases involving veterans. Chen had handled several high-profile cases where veterans were mistreated by the civilian justice system. "I've been following David's case," Chen told Rodriguez during their phone call. "His court-appointed lawyer is doing him no favors. Brady has a reputation for pushing plea deals instead of fighting for his clients. David needs real representation." Chen agreed to take David's case pro bono, but she warned Rodriguez that they would need to build public support to counter the negative media coverage. "The prosecutor is using this case to build his political career," she explained. "We need to change the narrative and show people who David really is." The veterans organized their first rally outside the courthouse on a cold Tuesday morning. About 50 people showed up, mostly older veterans carrying signs that read, "Justice for our brother," and "David Thompson is a hero, not a criminal." Colonel Rodriguez spoke to the small crowd, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years of military service. "David Thompson called the police to report a crime," Rodriguez said. "He was doing his civic duty just like he did his military duty when he served overseas. The system has failed him, but we won't fail him." Local news stations covered the rally, but the coverage was brief and skeptical. The reporters focused on the small turnout and questioned whether the veterans really knew all the facts about David's case. But the rally served its purpose. It showed David that he wasn't alone. When David saw the news coverage that evening, he broke down crying for the first time since his arrest. Linda held him as he sobbed, finally releasing the emotions he had been holding inside. "I thought everyone had given up on me," he whispered. The veterans weren't satisfied with just one rally. They organized a social media campaign using the hashtag #StandWithThompson. Marines, soldiers, sailors, and airmen from around the country began sharing David's story. along with their own experiences of how the justice system sometimes failed. Veterans. Sergeant First Class Angela Torres, who had served in Iraq, posted a video that went viral. "David Thompson represents the best of what it means to serve," she said, looking directly into the camera. "He risked his life for this country, and now he's being persecuted for trying to protect his community. This is wrong, and we need to make it right." The social media campaign began attracting attention from veteran advocacy groups and civil rights organizations. The NAACP announced they were monitoring David's case, and the Veterans of Foreign Wars issued a statement expressing concern about how David was being treated. More importantly, the campaign caught the attention of investigative journalists who began looking deeper into David's case. Reporter Michelle Davis from the regional public television station decided to do her own investigation after seeing the veteran's social media posts. Davis discovered several troubling facts that had been overlooked by the original newspaper coverage. The electronics store that was supposedly being burglarized had security cameras, but the police had never bothered to review the footage. The store owner confirmed that there had been several attempted break-ins in the area over the past month, but none of the previous incidents had led to arrests. Most significantly, Davis found out that the witness who supposedly saw David acting suspiciously was an elderly woman who later admitted she had been watching from her apartment window 3 blocks away. She couldn't positively identify anyone from that distance, especially at night. Davis's investigative report aired on the evening news 2 months after David's arrest. The story presented a very different picture than the original newspaper article. Instead of a dangerous criminal, viewers saw a decorated veteran who had dedicated his life to serving others. The report included interviews with several of David's fellow Marines, including Martinez, who broke down while describing how David had saved his life. "That man is my hero," Martinez said. "He doesn't deserve what's happening to him." The TV report also featured Colonel Rodriguez, who spoke about David's character and military service. "In 3 deployments, David Thompson never once failed to complete a mission or let down his fellow Marines," Rodriguez said. "The idea that he would commit a petty crime is absurd to anyone who knows him." Public opinion began to shift after the investigative report aired. The television station's Facebook page was flooded with comments supporting David, and several local businesses offered to donate money for his legal defense. The veterans took advantage of the momentum by organizing a much larger rally. This time, over 300 people showed up, including veterans from multiple wars, active duty service members on their day off, and civilian supporters who were outraged by David's treatment. The rally featured speakers who had served with David and could testify to his character. Each speaker told stories that painted a picture of a man who consistently put others before himself, whether in combat or in civilian life. Captain Chen, David's new lawyer, also spoke at the rally. She announced that she had filed motions challenging the prosecution's evidence and demanding access to the security camera footage that police had ignored. "David Thompson is innocent," she declared, "and we're going to prove it." The growing support gave David something he hadn't felt in months: hope. For the first time since his arrest, he began to believe that maybe the truth would come out. Maybe the system could still work for someone like him. But the veterans knew they were fighting an uphill battle against a prosecutor who was determined to get a conviction and a justice system that seemed stacked against their brother. They were prepared to keep fighting for as long as it took because that's what Marines do. They never leave a fellow Marine behind. 4-star General Patricia Hayes was reviewing morning briefings in her Pentagon office when her aide knocked on the door. Colonel Anderson, a young officer who handled community relations, had been following veteran issues across the country as part of his duties. "Ma'am, there's a case involving a Marine veteran that's getting significant attention in veteran communities," Anderson said, placing a folder on her desk. "The circumstances are quite troubling." General Hayes opened the folder and began reading about David Thompson's case. As one of the highest-ranking African-American officers in the military, she had faced her own share of discrimination and prejudice throughout her career. But she had also seen how the system could fail good people, especially minorities, when bias and assumptions took over. The general had worked her way up through the ranks over 30 years, breaking barriers, As both a woman and a person of color in the military, she understood the unique challenges that minority service members faced, both during their service and after they returned to civilian life. David's case reminded her of several incidents she had witnessed where good soldiers were judged unfairly because of their race. "Get me everything on Staff Sergeant Thompson's service record," General Hayes told Colonel Anderson. "I want to know exactly who we're dealing with here." What the general discovered over the next few days was remarkable. David Thompson's military file read like a textbook example of an exemplary Marine. His performance evaluations were consistently outstanding, and his fellow Marines and commanding officers had nothing but praise for his character and dedication. The general found records of a particularly dangerous mission during David's second deployment, where his unit had been pinned down by enemy fire. David had provided sniper cover for over 6 hours, allowing wounded Marines to be evacuated safely. His precision shooting and tactical awareness had prevented what could have been a massacre. But the most significant discovery came when General Hayes found a recommendation for a Silver Star that had been sitting in bureaucratic limbo for over 2 years. The paperwork detailed how David had risked his own life to save 3 wounded Marines during an ambush, using his sniper skills to eliminate enemy positions while under heavy fire. The recommendation had been written by David's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Foster, who described David's actions as extraordinary heroism in the face of overwhelming odds. Foster had written that David's courage and skill had directly saved the lives of at least 7 Marines that day. General Hayes was furious that such an important decoration had been delayed by red tape and administrative incompetence. She immediately ordered her staff to expedite the Silver Star approval process, but she also realized that David's heroism could be crucial to his legal defense. The general decided to conduct her own quiet investigation into the circumstances of David's arrest. She had contacts throughout the military and veteran communities, and she began making discreet phone calls to people who had served with David. Every conversation reinforced the same message. David Thompson was a man of unquestionable integrity. Sergeant Major Rodriguez described him as the kind of Marine you want watching your back. Captain Torres called him one of the most ethical people I've ever served with. The pattern was consistent and clear. General Hayes also reached out to David's supervisors at the VA hospital where he worked. Dr. Patricia Martinez, the chief of staff, was eager to talk about David's contributions to veteran care. "David has helped more struggling veterans than anyone else on our staff," Dr. Martinez explained. "He has a gift for connecting with people who are dealing with trauma and depression. Losing him has been devastating for our patients." The hospital's veteran counseling program had seen remarkable success rates since David joined the staff. Veterans who had been struggling with PTSD and adjustment issues showed significant improvement after working with David. His combination of military experience and genuine compassion made him uniquely effective at helping other veterans heal. As General Hayes dug deeper into the case, she became increasingly concerned about what she was learning. The police investigation had been sloppy and biased from the beginning. The officers had made assumptions based on David's race and had never seriously investigated the actual crime he had reported. The general discovered that there had been a string of similar break-ins in that area over the past several months. The same electronics store had been targeted twice before, and several other businesses had reported attempted burglaries. But instead of investigating this pattern, the police had focused all their attention on prosecuting David. General Hayes called her legal team to review the case files that had been made public. What they found was deeply troubling. The prosecution's case was built almost entirely on David's presence at the scene, despite the fact that he had called police himself to report the crime. The witness who supposedly saw David acting suspiciously had given conflicting statements to police. In her first interview, she said she saw someone near the store, but couldn't provide any details. In her second interview, after learning that police had arrested a black man, she suddenly became more specific about what she had seen. The security camera footage that could have resolved the case quickly had been ignored by investigators. General Hayes's team discovered that the electronics store had multiple cameras that would have clearly shown what happened that night, but police had never bothered to review the recordings. Most disturbing of all, the general learned that the actual burglars had struck again just 2 weeks after David's arrest. The same electronics store was successfully burglarized while David was sitting in jail awaiting trial. The thieves had used the exact same method of entry that David had reported seeing on the night of his arrest. General Hayes realized that this wasn't just a case of mistaken identity or poor police work. This was a systematic failure of justice that threatened to destroy the life of a genuine American hero. She began to understand that David's case represented something much larger than one man's legal troubles. The general had seen how military recruitment was affected when young people lost faith in American institutions. If veterans like David could be treated so badly by the justice system, it sent a message that military service didn't matter. It told potential recruits that their sacrifice might not be valued or respected. General Hayes also thought about the broader implications for veteran affairs. David's work at the VA hospital was helping other veterans heal and readjust to civilian life. His wrongful prosecution wasn't just hurting him personally, it was preventing him from helping other veterans who desperately needed his support. The general knew that her position gave her unique influence and responsibility. As one of the highest-ranking officers in the military, her voice carried weight that could cut through bureaucratic obstacles and media spin. She had the power to make people pay attention to David's case in a way that no one else could. But intervening in a civilian legal case was unprecedented for a military officer of her rank. General Hayes would be risking her own career and reputation by taking such a bold step. Military leaders were expected to stay out of civilian politics and legal matters, even when they involved veterans. Despite these risks, General Hayes felt a moral obligation to act. She had spent her entire career fighting for justice and defending American values. Watching a good Marine get railroaded by a corrupt system went against everything she believed in. The general began preparing for what she knew would be the most important decision of her career. She was going to use her position and influence to fight for David Thompson, regardless of the personal cost. It was what any good leader would do for one of their people, and David Thompson was still one of hers. Justice demanded action, and General Hayes was ready to provide it. The morning of David's preliminary hearing arrived gray and cold, with a light drizzle that matched the somber mood hanging over the courthouse. David sat in the back of Captain Chen's car, wearing the only decent suit he owned, trying to calm his nerves. His hands were shaking slightly and he couldn't stop his leg from bouncing up and down. "Remember what we talked about," Captain Chen said as they pulled into the courthouse parking lot. "No matter what the prosecutor says, keep your expression calm. The judge will be watching everything." Linda squeezed David's hand as they got out of the car. She had taken another day off work to be there, even though they couldn't afford to lose the income. "We're going to get through this," she whispered, though her own voice was trembling. The courthouse was busier than usual. Word had spread through the veteran community that this was an important day for David's case. Veterans from across the region had driven hours to be there, filling the courthouse steps and lobby. Many wore their old military uniforms or veteran organization jackets showing their support for one of their own. Colonel Rodriguez stood near the courthouse entrance greeting veterans as they arrived. He had coordinated with veteran groups to ensure a strong showing of support. "David needs to see that he's not alone in there," Rodriguez told each person who came to show support. Inside the courthouse, the small courtroom was packed beyond capacity. The gallery was filled with veterans, family members, and community supporters who had been following David's case. Local news cameras were set up in the back, and reporters were interviewing people in the hallway. District Attorney Mitchell sat at the prosecution table, confident and relaxed. He had spent the morning reviewing his notes and preparing for what he expected to be a routine hearing. Mitchell believed he had a strong case, and he was looking forward to the media attention that would come from prosecuting a high-profile defendant. Prosecutor Walsh sat beside Mitchell, organizing her files and preparing to present evidence against David. She had built what she thought was a compelling case based on David's presence at the scene and the witness testimony. Walsh was eager to prove herself in such a visible case. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom at exactly 9 a.m., and everyone rose as the bailiff called the court to order. Judge Harrison was known for running an efficient courtroom and had little patience for theatrics or delays. He looked out at the packed gallery with some surprise but said nothing about the unusual crowd. David sat at the defense table next to Captain Chen, trying to appear confident despite the fear gnawing at his stomach. He glanced back at the gallery and felt a surge of emotion seeing so many people who had come to support him. Linda sat in the front row, and she gave him an encouraging nod. The hearing began with Prosecutor Walsh presenting the state's case against David. She described him as a trained military sniper who had used his skills to case the electronics store for a planned burglary. Walsh painted a picture of a calculated criminal who had been caught in the act. The defendant was found at the scene of an attempted burglary, Walsh told the judge. He had the training and knowledge to carry out such a crime, and a witness saw him acting suspiciously near the targeted business. Captain Chen was preparing to respond when something unexpected happened. The courtroom doors opened, and a murmur went through the crowd. Someone important was entering, but David couldn't see who it was from where he sat. The murmur grew louder, and Judge Harrison looked up from his notes with curiosity. Even the court reporter stopped typing and turned to see what was causing the commotion. Prosecutor Walsh paused in the middle of her presentation, confused by the disruption. Then David saw her. Four-star General Patricia Hayes walked through the courtroom doors wearing her full dress uniform, complete with ribbons, medals, and the 4 stars that marked her as one of the most senior officers in the entire military. The sight was so unexpected and impressive that the entire courtroom fell completely silent. General Hayes moved with the confidence and authority that came from decades of military leadership. Her uniform was immaculate, every detail perfect, and the weight of her rank was impossible to ignore. She walked steadily down the center aisle, her eyes fixed on the judge's bench. David's mouth fell open in shock. He had never met General Hayes personally, but every Marine knew who she was. She was a legend in the military, a trailblazer who had broken barriers and earned respect through her exceptional service. The idea that she was here in his courtroom seemed impossible. Judge Harrison was clearly surprised by the general's presence. It was unprecedented for such a high-ranking military officer to appear in his courtroom, especially during a civilian criminal case. He wasn't sure what protocol to follow, but he knew this was significant. "Your Honor," General Hayes said in a clear, strong voice that carried throughout the courtroom, "I request permission to address the court regarding Staff Sergeant David Thompson, a decorated Marine who served with distinction under my overall command structure." The judge looked uncertain. This was definitely not something covered in his usual procedures manual. He glanced at the prosecutors, who looked just as confused as he felt. After a moment of consideration, Judge Harrison decided to allow the general to speak. "Permission granted, General Hayes," the judge said. "Please proceed." General Hayes moved to the center of the courtroom, positioning herself where everyone could see and hear her clearly. She looked first at David, giving him a small nod of acknowledgement, then turned to address the judge directly. "Your Honor, I have spent considerable time reviewing the service record and character of Staff Sergeant Thompson," General Hayes began. "In 30 years of military service, I have rarely encountered a Marine of such exceptional integrity and courage." The general went on to describe David's military service in detail, painting a picture of a man who had consistently put his life on the line for his fellow Marines and his country. She spoke about his 3 combat deployments, his exemplary performance evaluations, and the respect he had earned from every officer who had served with him. Staff Sergeant Thompson saved the lives of at least 7 Marines during a particularly dangerous mission in Afghanistan, General Hayes continued. His actions that day were so extraordinary that he has been recommended for the Silver Star, our nation's 3rd highest military decoration for valor. The general pulled out an official document and held it up for the court to see. "I have here the signed authorization for Staff Sergeant Thompson's Silver Star, which was delayed by administrative processes, but has now been approved at the highest levels of military command." A gasp went through the courtroom. Even Judge Harrison looked impressed. The Silver Star was a decoration that few Marines ever received, reserved for acts of exceptional heroism in combat situations. But General Hayes wasn't finished. She had saved her most devastating revelation for last. Your Honor, I must also inform the court that military investigators, working with federal law enforcement agencies, have identified the actual perpetrators of the attempted burglary that Staff Sergeant Thompson reported to police. The color drained from Prosecutor Walsh's face. This was information she had never heard before, and it threatened to destroy her entire case. General Hayes continued, "The real criminals are part of an organized theft ring that has been operating in this area for several months. They were identified through security camera footage that, unfortunately, local police never bothered to review." Judge Harrison leaned forward, clearly intrigued by this development. "General, are you saying that Staff Sergeant Thompson was telling the truth when he claimed to have reported a crime?" "Exactly, Your Honor," General Hayes replied. "Staff Sergeant Thompson did exactly what any good citizen should do. He saw a crime in progress and immediately called police to report it. The tragedy is that instead of investigating the actual criminals, law enforcement arrested the man who was trying to help them." The courtroom was completely silent as the implications of General Hayes's words sank in. David felt tears welling up in his eyes. After months of being treated like a criminal, finally someone with real authority was telling the truth about what had happened. Prosecutor Walsh tried to object, but her voice came out as little more than a whisper. District Attorney Mitchell looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The case they had built their reputations on was crumbling in real time. General Hayes turned to look directly at David, her expression showing both respect and compassion. "Staff Sergeant Thompson represents the very best of what it means to serve this country," she said. "He has dedicated his post-military career to helping fellow veterans heal and readjust to civilian life. The idea that such a man would commit a petty crime is not just wrong. It's insulting to everyone who has worn the uniform." Judge Harrison looked at the prosecution table, where Walsh and Mitchell were frantically whispering to each other. It was clear that they knew their case was over. "Mr. Mitchell," the judge said, "in light of this new information, how does the state wish to proceed?" Mitchell stood up slowly, his political ambitions crashing down around him. "Your Honor, the state moves to dismiss all charges against the defendant." The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Veterans jumped to their feet, clapping and shouting.